Sometimes the things we leave behind carry more weight than the things we take with us. In the quiet solitude of the Montana peaks, where memories settle like morning mist on the lakes, sat an old boat that most folks had long forgotten. The locals called her the Widow's Wake, a rotting hull that had rested on Dead Elk Lake's shore for decades. Boone Tiller, a weathered mountain man with 50 winters under his belt, saw something others missed in that old wreck. He bought her for nothing more than dry goods and a knife, planning to strip her wood for a cabin. But when he pried open a hidden hatch beneath the floorboards, Boone found an iron strongbox packed with gold coins, old bonds, and a journal from a railroad baron who vanished in 1882. Who would hide such a fortune in a boat with no business being on a mountain lake? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The morning air carried the scent of pine needles and wood smoke as Boone Tiller stepped out of his cabin, his weathered hands wrapped around a steaming cup of coffee that had seen better days. At 67, his frame still held the lean strength of a man who'd spent his life working with his hands, though his dark hair had long since given way to silver that caught the early light like frost on granite. The lines around his eyes spoke of decades spent squinting against mountain sun and wind. Each crease a story of winters survived and summers savored in the high country of Montana. His cabin sat perched on a ridge overlooking Dead Elk Lake, a body of water so remote that most maps didn't bother marking it. The structure itself was a testament to patient craftsmanship, each log carefully selected and fitted, the chinking mixed with clay from the lakeshore below. Boone had built it with his own hands over the course of 3 summers, back when his knees didn't remind him of every climb and his back didn't protest each morning's rising. Now, 30 years later, it remained as solid as the day he'd driven the final nail, weathered but unbroken. Much like the man who called it home, the lake stretched out before him like a mirror, its surface broken only by the occasional rise of a trout taking insects from the water. On the far shore, perhaps a quarter-mile distant, the Widow's Wake sat tilted against the rocky bank where she'd rested for more years than anyone could rightly remember. From this distance, she looked like a sleeping giant, her hull dark with age and moss, her masts long since rotted away or removed. Most mornings, Boone barely glanced at the old vessel, but today, something about the way the light fell across her made him pause. He'd first heard the story of the boat from old Pete Hawkins, a trapper who'd worked these mountains back when fur was still worth something. Pete had been drinking whiskey by a campfire one October night, the kind of cold that made a man's bones ache when he'd pointed across the water with a gnarled finger and spun his tail. According to Pete, the boat had appeared one spring morning in 1883, hauled up the mountain by a crew of men who spoke little and worked fast. They'd used teams of oxen and a system of pulleys that must have taken weeks to rig. Dragging that heavy hull up terrain that would challenge a mule weren't no accident. "The boat ending up here," Pete had said, his voice rough from years of tobacco and mountain air. "Man don't haul a seaworthy vessel to a lake you can't even find without knowing these peaks like scripture, unless he's got powerful reasons for keeping something hidden." The story had stuck with Boone through the years. One of those tales that seemed too strange to be true, but too detailed to be entirely false. Pete claimed the boat had belonged to a railroad man named Marcus Whitmore, one of those Eastern money men who'd made his fortune connecting the continent with steel rails. Whitmore had vanished somewhere in the Montana Territory during the winter of 1882, along with a private train car and enough gold to buy half the territory. The official story was that he'd been killed by bandits, but Pete had his doubts. "Rich men don't disappear without leaving tracks," he'd said, "unless he's got help making those tracks disappear." Now sipping his coffee in the morning quiet, Boone found himself studying the boat with fresh eyes. He'd been thinking lately about the cabin expansion he'd been planning, a proper workshop where he could work on his wood carving during the long winter months. The project would require more lumber than he could afford to buy and haul up the mountain, but salvaged wood from the old boat might serve the purpose. Besides, it seemed a shame to let all that timber rot away to nothing when it could serve a useful purpose. The decision to approach Jacob Hensley about buying the boat wasn't one Boone made lightly. Hensley owned most of the land around Dead Elk Lake, inherited from his grandfather, who'd claimed it during the homestead era. Jacob was a decent enough man, though he'd grown soft from years of living in town and only visiting the mountain property during hunting season. Still, he held clear title to the lake and everything around it, including one moss-covered boat that had been depreciating in value for the better part of 4 decades. Boone finished his coffee and set the cup on the porch rail, his mind already working through the conversation he'd need to have with Hensley. The man was practical enough. He'd probably be glad to get a few dollars for something that had been nothing but a curiosity for years. A sack of quality dry goods and one of Boone's hand-forged skinning knives would likely seal the deal, especially if Boone offered to clean up the lakeshore in the bargain. The walk down to the water took him along a familiar trail that switchbacked through stands of lodgepole pine and scattered boulders left behind by glaciers that had retreated long before any white man set foot in these mountains. Boone had walked this path thousands of times over the years, but he never tired of the way it revealed the lake, in glimpses through the trees, before opening onto the rocky shore where he kept his small rowboat. The boat was a simple affair, built for function rather than beauty, with a flat bottom that could handle the shallow areas near shore, and a width that provided stability in the mountain winds that could turn a calm lake into a challenging paddle. Boone had built her himself from plans he'd found in an old magazine, working through one winter when cabin fever had him restless and eager for spring. As he rowed across the lake, the morning sun climbed higher, burning off the mist that clung to the water's surface. The only sounds were the creak of the oarlocks and the gentle splash of water against the hull. Occasionally, a fish would jump somewhere nearby, sending concentric circles, spreading across the surface like ripples in time itself. The widow's wake grew larger as he approached, revealing details that distance had hidden. Her hull was oak, he could see now, darkened by age, but still solid-looking beneath the coating of moss and lichen. She'd been a substantial vessel in her day, perhaps 40 feet long, with a beam that suggested she'd been built for cargo rather than passengers. Her lines spoke of craftsmanship from an era when shipbuilders took pride in their work, when a vessel was expected to serve for generations rather than seasons. Boone beached his rowboat and climbed up the rocky shore to where the widow's wake lay canted against the bank. Up close, the mystery of her presence became even more puzzling. The boat showed no signs of the damage one would expect from being dragged overland. No gouges from rocks, no broken planking from rough handling. If anything, she looked as though she'd been carefully placed here, positioned with the same attention to detail that had gone into her original construction. Walking around the hull, Boone noticed that her bottom showed signs of having been reinforced, with additional planking added in patterns that suggested someone had prepared her for a journey very different from anything she'd been designed for. Metal brackets had been bolted to her sides, brackets that could have supported a framework for lifting or moving the vessel. This wasn't the work of desperate men in a hurry. This was planning, preparation, and considerable expense. The afternoon sun was slanting low through the pines by the time Boone returned to his cabin, his mind full of questions and possibilities. The boat was more than just a source of salvaged lumber. She was a puzzle that had been waiting 40 years for someone to take the time to solve it. As he prepared his evening meal of trout and wild onions, Boone found himself planning not just a conversation with Jacob Hensley, but the beginning of an investigation into one of the mountain's most enduring mysteries. That night, as he sat on his porch watching the stars emerge in the clear mountain sky, Boone thought about old Pete's words. Rich men didn't disappear without leaving tracks, unless they had help making those tracks disappear. Perhaps it was time someone followed those tracks, even if they'd grown cold with the passage of decades. Perhaps it was time to find out what secrets the widow's wake had been keeping all these years. The lake reflected the stars like scattered diamonds, and somewhere in that darkness, an old boat waited with patience that only the mountains could teach. Tomorrow, Boone decided, he'd take the first step toward uncovering whatever truth lay hidden in her weathered hull. After all, he'd always been partial to things that others had left behind. The drive down to Hensley's place in Millerville took Boone the better part of 2 hours, his old pickup truck groaning through the switchbacks that connected his mountain sanctuary to the world below. He'd made this journey only a handful of times each year, usually for supplies he couldn't make or grow himself, and each trip reminded him why he preferred the solitude of the high country. The town had grown since his last visit, with new houses sprawling across what had once been pasture land, and a convenience store where Merla's feed shop used to stand. Jacob Hensley ran a small insurance office on Main Street, the kind of business that served the ranchers and townsfolk who needed coverage for their homes, vehicles, and livelihoods. Boone found him behind a desk covered with paperwork, looking every bit the soft town man that mountain gossip made him out to be. But Jacob's handshake was firm, and his eyes held the steady gaze of someone who understood the value of straight dealing. "Boone Tiller," Jacob said, settling back in his chair. "Haven't seen you down here in, 6 months? What brings you to civilization?" "That old boat on your lake," Boone replied, getting straight to the point. "Been thinking I could use the lumber for a workshop addition. Wondered if you'd consider selling her." Jacob's eyebrows rose slightly. "That old wreck? Hell, Boone, I've been meaning to have someone haul her away for years. She's not exactly adding to the property value up there. What would you consider fair?" The negotiation was simpler than Boone had expected. Jacob was genuinely pleased to have someone willing to take responsibility for removing what he'd come to see as an eyesore. A sack of quality jerky, some of Boone's preserved vegetables, and one of his hand-forged knives sealed the deal, along with a handwritten bill of sale that gave Boone full ownership of one abandoned watercraft known locally as the Widow's Wake, including all contents therein. That last phrase would prove more significant than either man realized at the time. 3 days later, Boone stood on the shore of Dead Elk Lake with a canvas bag full of tools and a crowbar that had served him well through decades of mountain living. The morning was crisp, with the kind of clear air that made every detail stand out sharp and clean. He'd brought his camera, an old film model that had belonged to his father, figuring he should document the boat before he began breaking her apart. Something about the vessel's careful placement and obvious quality made him want to preserve her memory. Even as he prepared to reclaim her materials, he started with the deck, prying up planks that had been softened by decades of weather but still held the sweet scent of aged oak. Beneath the surface wood, he found the boat's construction was even more substantial than he'd realized. Her frames were massive, cut from what must have been old-growth timber, and her planking was thick enough to stop a rifle bullet. This hadn't been built as a pleasure craft. She'd been constructed to carry serious weight over serious distance. Working methodically, Boone removed the decking to reveal the cargo hold beneath. What he found there made him pause, his crowbar forgotten in his hands. The hold had been carefully divided into compartments, each lined with what appeared to be oiled canvas that had somehow survived the decades. Most of the compartments were empty, but their configuration suggested they'd been designed to hold specific items, long, narrow spaces that could have accommodated rifles or tools. Square sections sized for boxes or cases, it was in the smallest compartment, tucked beneath what had once been the mast step, that Boone's crowbar struck something that rang with the hollow sound of metal on metal. He worked more carefully now, removing the wooden covering to reveal a hatch that had been sealed with both tar and a clever mechanism that required specific pressure points to open. Someone had gone to considerable trouble to keep this space secure. The hatch opened with a grinding protest of metal that hadn't moved in decades. Beneath it lay a space no larger than a coffin, lined with oiled leather that had protected its contents from the moisture that had claimed so much of the boat's interior. And there, wrapped in oilcloth that crackled with age, was an iron strongbox that clearly predated the boat itself. Boone lifted the box carefully, surprised by its weight. The metal was cold against his hands, and he could feel the subtle shift of contents inside. The lock was ornate, crafted in an era when even functional items carried artistic flourishes. A maker's mark stamped into the metal read, Mosler Safe Co. New York, with a date of 1879. Setting the box on the shore beside his tools, Boone stood and surveyed the lake around him. The morning had grown warm, and the silence was so complete he could hear his own heartbeat. For decades, this strongbox had waited in darkness, protected by layers of security that spoke of both wealth and paranoia. Whatever it contained had been important enough to justify hauling a 40-foot boat into the Montana wilderness. The lock proved surprisingly cooperative after a few drops of penetrating oil and patient work with picks that Boone had crafted years ago for repairing the mechanical traps he used for small game. When the mechanism finally clicked open, the sound seemed to echo across the water like a gunshot. Inside the box, wrapped in oiled silk that had preserved them perfectly, were things that made Boone's hands tremble slightly as he lifted them into the mountain sunlight. Gold coins, more than he'd ever seen in one place, each one bearing dates from the 1870s and early 1880s, bearer bonds from railroad companies that had built the transcontinental lines, each certificate representing wealth that would have been staggering in its time. And beneath it all, a leather-bound journal written in a careful hand that introduced itself on the first page. The private records of Marcus Whitmore, president of the Northern Mountain Railroad Company, begun this 15th day of October. In the year of our Lord, 1881, Boone closed the journal quickly, his mind reeling with the implications of what he'd found. This wasn't just salvage lumber or an interesting piece of mountain history. This was evidence of one of the territory's most famous disappearances, along with what appeared to be a fortune that had vanished along with the man who'd accumulated it. The sun was directly overhead by the time Boone had carefully repacked the strongbox and loaded it into his rowboat. He left the boat's hull intact for now, his plans for salvage lumber suddenly seeming far less important than understanding what he'd stumbled into. The journal alone would require careful study, and the bonds and gold coins needed to be properly evaluated and secured. As he rowed back across the lake, Boone found himself glancing repeatedly over his shoulder at the widow's wake, as though the old boat might somehow disappear now that she'd given up her secret. The weight of the strongbox in the bottom of his rowboat felt like more than just metal and paper. It felt like responsibility, like the first piece of a puzzle that someone had spent considerable effort to scatter. Back at his cabin, Boone carried the strongbox inside and set it on his kitchen table, the same table where he'd eaten simple meals and read simple books for 3 decades. Now it held what might be the key to solving one of Montana's oldest mysteries, along with enough wealth to change his life in ways he wasn't sure he wanted to contemplate. The mountain quiet that had always brought him peace now felt charged with possibility and uncertainty. As evening settled over Dead Elk Lake, Boone opened the journal to its first page and began to read about a man named Marcus Whitmore, who had disappeared into these very mountains, carrying secrets that someone had tried very hard to keep buried. The journal of Marcus Whitmore revealed itself slowly, like a photograph developing in chemical baths. Boone read by lamplight, his weathered fingers turning pages with the care of a man handling butterfly wings. Each entry painted the picture of a man caught between ambition and conscience, between the ruthless demands of railroad building and the growing weight of moral compromise. Whitmore's early entries, dated from October 1881, spoke of routine business, supply contracts, labor negotiations, and the endless challenge of pushing rail lines through territory that seemed determined to resist civilization. But as winter approached, the tone began to shift. References appeared to irregularities in government land grants, to payments made to officials who should have been impartial, to Native American burial grounds that had been deliberately destroyed to clear rights of way. I have become wealthy by methods that would shame my father. Whitmore had written in December of 1881, each mile of track represents not just steel and timber, but compromises that eat at a man's soul like acid. I fear I have sold my integrity for fool's gold. And now the price demanded grows steeper with each passing season. Boone paused in his reading to pour himself a cup of coffee, his mind working through the implications of what he was learning. Whitmore hadn't been just another robber baron. He'd been a man awakening to the true cost of his success. The journal entries grew more troubled as they progressed into 1882. Chronicling a growing conflict between Whitmore's conscience and the expectations of his business partners. The railroad president had begun keeping detailed records of questionable transactions, documenting bribes paid to territorial officials, fraudulent land claims, and the systematic displacement of Native American tribes. It read like the confession of a man preparing for judgment, someone building a case against his own empire. Thompson grows suspicious of my questions, read an entry from March 1882. He reminds me daily that our fortunes are intertwined, that exposure of certain practices would destroy us all. But I begin to wonder if destruction might not be preferable to continued participation in this corruption. A man can only compromise his principles so far before he ceases to be a man at all. The name Thompson appeared frequently in the later entries, always in contexts that suggested tension and distrust. Silas Thompson, Whitmore's business partner and the Northern Mountain Railroad's primary investor, emerged from the journal pages as a man of ruthless pragmatism, who viewed ethical considerations as obstacles to be overcome rather than principles to be honored. As Boone read deeper into the journal, he began to understand the true purpose of the strong box and its mountain hiding place. Whitmore hadn't simply disappeared. He'd been preparing for flight, accumulating evidence and portable wealth while planning his escape from a business relationship that had become intolerable. The boat on Dead Elk Lake wasn't random. It was part of an elaborate plan to vanish completely while preserving evidence that could someday bring justice to those who remained. I have made arrangements. For the boat, read an entry from August 1882. Harrison assures me his men can transport it to the mountain lake without attracting attention. The location is perfect, remote enough to avoid discovery, yet accessible should I need to retrieve what I have hidden there. If Thompson or his associates discover my intentions before I can act, at least the evidence will survive my demise. The final entries, dated just weeks before Whitmore's disappearance, revealed a man living in constant fear of discovery. He wrote of being followed, of conversations that stopped when he entered rooms, of the growing certainty that his partners had decided he represented an unacceptable risk to their continued prosperity. "They mean to kill me," the last entry stated with chilling directness. Thompson has made his decision, though he is too much a coward to act directly. I have perhaps days before they move against me. The gold and bonds are secured in the strongbox, along with copies of the most damaging documents. If I cannot live to see justice done, perhaps others will find the means to complete what I have begun. Boone closed the journal and sat back in his chair, the implications of what he'd read settling over him like mountain shadows. Whitmore had indeed been murdered, just as old Pete had suspected, but not by random bandits. He'd been eliminated by his own business partners, men who had built fortunes on corruption and couldn't afford to let their former colleague expose their crimes. The strongbox represented more than hidden wealth. It was a time bomb that had been ticking for over 40 years, waiting for someone to discover its contents and understand their significance. The bearer bonds and gold coins were valuable, certainly, but the real treasure was the evidence Whitmore had compiled against the Northern Mountain Railroad and its investors. Rising from the table, Boone walked to his window and gazed out at Dead Elk Lake, where moonlight turned the water into liquid silver. Somewhere out there, the widow's wake rested against the shore, her secret finally revealed after decades of patient waiting. But revealing the secret was only the beginning. Understanding what to do with it would prove far more challenging. The money alone presented problems that Boone had never imagined facing. The gold coins were surely worth a fortune in today's market, and the bearer bonds, if still valid, could represent wealth beyond his ability to calculate. But claiming that wealth would require explanations he wasn't prepared to give, documentation he couldn't provide, and attention he had spent 30 years avoiding. More troubling were the implications of Whitmore's accusations. If the Northern Mountain Railroad had been built on corruption and murder, what had become of that corruption in the decades since? Had the guilty parties simply died of old age, or had their crimes been passed down, like family heirlooms, to new generations? The railroad itself had been absorbed by larger companies over the years, but wealth and influence had a way of perpetuating themselves across time. Boone returned to the strongbox and examined its contents more carefully. Beneath the journal lay documents that supported Whitmore's claims, land deeds obtained through bribery, contracts with suppliers who existed only on paper, and correspondence with territorial officials who had been systematically corrupted. The evidence was methodical and damning, assembled by a man who understood that accusations without proof were merely gossip. Among the papers, Boone found something that made his blood run cold. A letter dated September 1882, written in a hand different from Whitmore's, contained explicit threats against the railroad president and detailed plans for his elimination. The signature at the bottom read, S. Thompson, and the seal, pressed into the red wax, bore the initials NMRR, Northern Mountain Railroad. Thompson hadn't just ordered Whitmore's death, he'd been foolish enough to document it. Whether from arrogance or carelessness, he'd created evidence that could have destroyed him if it had ever been discovered by the right authorities. That it had remained hidden for 4 decades was testament to Whitmore's careful planning and the remote location he'd chosen for his final gamble. As the night deepened around his cabin, Boone found himself facing questions that would have seemed absurd just days earlier. What obligations did a man have to pursue justice for crimes committed before he was born? What risks was he willing to accept to honor the final wishes of a dead stranger? And perhaps most importantly, was he prepared for the possibility that some secrets had remained buried for very good reasons? The strongbox sat on his table like a sleeping cat, deceptively peaceful but charged with potential energy. Inside, it lay enough evidence to rewrite the history of Montana's territorial period, along with enough wealth to transform his simple mountain existence into something he wasn't sure he wanted to become. Sleep came fitfully to Boone that night, filled with dreams of trains cutting through virgin wilderness and men in dark coats conducting business in shadowed rooms. He woke before dawn, his mind immediately returning to the strongbox and its implications. Coffee helped clear his thoughts, but couldn't shake the feeling that his quiet mountain existence had been permanently altered by what he'd discovered. The morning light revealed something he'd missed in his initial examination of the documents. Tucked between the pages of Whitmore's journal was a hand-drawn map, carefully rendered in the railroad president's precise script. It showed the territory around Dead Elk Lake in remarkable detail, including landmarks that still existed and others that time had erased. But most significantly, it marked a second location, a cabin site approximately 3 miles north of the lake, designated with the notation, Final Cache, Emergency Use Only. Boone studied the map over breakfast, comparing it to his own knowledge of the surrounding terrain. The location Whitmore had marked sat in a narrow valley between 2 ridges, accessible only by a game trail that most people would never find. If there was indeed a cache hidden there, it had been placed with the same careful planning that had gone into hiding the strongbox. The decision to investigate took shape slowly, competing with his natural inclination to avoid complications. But curiosity, that fundamental trait that had driven him to explore every corner of these mountains over the years, eventually won out. Whatever Whitmore had hidden at that second location might provide answers to questions the journal had raised, but not resolved. The hike north took him through country he knew well. Though the old game trail proved more challenging than he remembered, age had a way of making familiar terrain feel newly difficult, reminding him that his body no longer responded to demands with the eager strength of youth. Still, his wind held good, and his footing remained sure on slopes that would challenge men half his age. The valley, when he finally reached it, showed clear signs of human presence from decades past. The foundation stones of a small structure remained visible beneath decades of accumulated pine needles and debris. Someone had built here with care, selecting a site that was sheltered from wind but open to southern exposure. With access to a spring that still ran clear and cold, working methodically, Boone cleared away the forest debris and began to understand what Whitmore had constructed in this remote place. The cabin had been small but well built, designed for temporary occupation rather than permanent residence. More importantly, it had been constructed with a hidden basement, accessible through a trapdoor that had been carefully concealed beneath the main floor. The basement, when Boone finally gained access to it, proved to be a marvel of planning and execution. Stone-lined walls kept the space dry, while carefully positioned drainage channels directed groundwater away from the interior. Wooden shelves built into the walls held supplies that spoke of long-term preparation: preserved foods, medical supplies, tools, and clothing, all wrapped in oiled canvas and stored in metal containers that had protected them from rodents and moisture. But the true treasure of the basement lay in a second strongbox, smaller than the first but equally well constructed. This one bore no maker's mark, suggesting it had been custom-built for Whitmore's specific purposes. Inside, Boone found what appeared to be Whitmore's insurance policy, original documents that proved the corruption allegations in his journal, along with additional evidence that painted an even darker picture of the Northern Mountain Railroad's activities. Among the papers was correspondence between Silas Thompson and Territorial, officials that documented systematic bribery on a scale that would have shocked even the cynical standards of the era. Land grants had been purchased rather than earned. Environmental protections had been ignored in exchange for cash payments, and Native American treaty violations had been not just tolerated, but actively encouraged. Most damning of all was a series of letters between Thompson and a man identified only as the Colonel, discussing the elimination of witnesses to their various crimes. Whitmore's name appeared on a list of problems requiring permanent solutions, along with several territorial officials who had apparently grown uncomfortable with their roles in the corruption. Reading these documents in the dim light of his electric lantern, Boone began to understand the true scope of what Whitmore had discovered. The Northern Mountain Railroad hadn't just been a corrupt business enterprise. It had been the center of a criminal conspiracy that had shaped the development of the entire Montana Territory. The wealth that had built some of the region's most prominent families had been extracted through methods that were not just unethical but genuinely evil. A leather portfolio at the bottom of the strongbox contained what appeared to be Whitmore's final preparations for flight. Bank account numbers for institutions in Denver and San Francisco, travel routes that would have taken him far from Thompson's reach, and most intriguingly, the names and addresses of newspaper editors and federal officials who might have been willing to pursue justice if presented with sufficient evidence. "If I cannot live to see this through," Whitmore had written in a note attached to the portfolio, "I pray that whoever finds these documents will have the courage to complete what I began. The dead deserve justice, and the living deserve truth. The wealth hidden with these papers should provide sufficient resources to pursue both. Should anyone prove willing to accept the burden I could not carry to completion." Boone carefully repacked the documents and carried the strongbox back to his cabin as afternoon shadows began to lengthen across the mountains. The weight of what he'd discovered pressed on him like storm clouds, gathering over the peaks. Whitmore's evidence was comprehensive and damning, but it was also 40 years old. Most of the men it accused were surely long dead, their crimes buried with them in graves scattered across the country. Yet as he examined the papers more carefully that evening, patterns began to emerge that suggested the story hadn't ended with Whitmore's death. The Northern Mountain Railroad had been absorbed by the Great Northern Railway in 1889, which had later become part of the Burlington Northern System. The wealth generated by the original corruption had been invested and reinvested across the decades, growing into fortunes that still shaped the region's economic and political landscape. Names that appeared in Whitmore's documents as minor players in the 1880s corruption had evolved into prominent families whose influence extended far beyond Montana's borders. Thompson himself had died in 1903, but his estate had passed to sons and grandsons, who had built their own empires on the foundation he had laid through bribery and murder. The implications were staggering. If Whitmore's evidence was accurate, and the detailed documentation suggested it was, then some of the West's most respected family fortunes had been built on crimes that would have been shocking, even by the brutal standards of the territorial era. More troubling still was the possibility that knowledge of those original crimes had been passed down through generations, creating ongoing obligations and vulnerabilities that could explain much about the region's modern power structures. As he sat at his kitchen table surrounded by documents that could rewrite Montana's history, Boone realized that Whitmore's burden had now become his own. The question was no longer what to do with the evidence, but whether he possessed the courage to see justice done, regardless of the personal cost. The weight of decision pressed on Boone through the following days like a persistent ache in his bones. He found himself walking the familiar trails around his property with new eyes, seeing not just the timeless beauty of the mountains, but the human stories they held. Every stand of timber, every cleared meadow, every old mining scar carved into the slopes represented choices made by people long dead, consequences that rippled forward through generations like stones thrown into still water. The bearer bonds proved more complex than he'd initially realized. A trip to the Millerville Library, his first visit to that dusty repository in over a decade, revealed that several of the companies that had issued the bonds still existed in some form, having been absorbed by larger corporations over the years. If the bonds were still valid, and if they could be redeemed without triggering unwanted attention, they represented wealth beyond anything he'd ever imagined possessing. But wealth, Boone was beginning to understand, came with its own set of problems. The librarian, a sharp-eyed woman named Margaret Chen, who'd moved to Montana from Seattle the previous year, had noticed his unusual research requests and asked casual questions that suggested genuine curiosity rather than mere politeness. Her interest in local history and her outsider's perspective made her both a potential ally and a possible complication. "You know," Margaret said, as she helped him locate historical railroad documents, "there's been renewed interest lately in some of the territorial period business practices. Academic researchers mostly, but also some investigative journalists looking into how certain family fortunes were originally accumulated. Funny how history has a way of becoming relevant again, isn't it?" Her comment stayed with him as he drove back up the mountain, suggesting that the past Whitmore had tried to expose might not be as safely buried as he'd assumed. If modern researchers were already asking questions about territorial-era corruption, his evidence could provide answers they'd been seeking, but it could also make him a target for people who preferred those questions to remain unanswered. Back at his cabin, Boone spread Whitmore's map across his kitchen table and studied it with growing fascination. The railroad president had been remarkably thorough in documenting the geography around Dead Elk Lake, noting not just obvious landmarks, but subtle features that revealed an intimate knowledge of the terrain. Game trails were marked with seasonal notations, water sources were rated for reliability, and several locations were designated with cryptic symbols that suggested additional significance. One symbol in particular caught his attention: a small triangle marked at a location, about 5 miles southeast of his cabin, in country that Boone knew to be particularly rough and difficult to access. The symbol was accompanied by the notation TB, evidence secured, followed by what appeared to be compass bearings and distance measurements. The more Boone studied the map, the more convinced he became that Whitmore had hidden additional caches throughout the area. The man had been planning not just his own escape, but the preservation of evidence that could someday bring his killers to justice. Each hidden location represented another piece of an elaborate puzzle, another element in a plan that had been 40 years in the making. The decision to investigate the marked location came gradually, driven by the same methodical curiosity that had led him to examine every corner of his mountain domain over the decades. If there was indeed evidence cached at that remote site, it might provide context for documents he'd already found, or reveal new dimensions to the corruption Whitmore had discovered. The hike to the southeastern location proved more challenging than he'd anticipated. The terrain was steep and broken, cut by ravines that forced constant detours and climbs that left him breathing hard despite his mountain conditioning. Twice, he lost the old game trail entirely and had to backtrack to pick up signs of the route Whitmore must have followed more than 4 decades earlier. When he finally reached the coordinates marked on the map, Boone found himself standing in a natural amphitheater carved into the mountainside by centuries of erosion. Steep walls surrounded a relatively flat area, perhaps 50 yards across, with a single narrow entrance that would be nearly impossible to find without specific directions. It was the kind of place that could remain hidden indefinitely, known only to those who had reason to seek it out. The cache itself was more sophisticated than the basement hideout had been. Whitmore had constructed what amounted to a stone vault, built into the base of the amphitheater's back wall and sealed with fitted stones that blended perfectly with the natural rock formation. Only someone looking for it with specific knowledge would ever notice the subtle signs of human construction. Inside the vault, protected by multiple layers of oiled canvas and metal containers, Boone found what appeared to be Whitmore's photographic evidence. Glass plate negatives, dozens of them, each carefully labeled and dated. When he held them up to the light, he could make out images that corresponded to locations and events described. In the written documents he'd already found, there were photographs of meetings between railroad officials and territorial authorities, images of Native American burial sites being destroyed for right-of-way construction, and most damning of all, pictures of what appeared to be the systematic looting of archaeological sites along the proposed rail routes. Someone, presumably Whitmore himself, had documented the Northern Mountain Railroad's crimes with the methodical thoroughness of a prosecutor building a case for trial. Among the negatives was a photograph that made Boone's hands tremble as he held it to the light. The image showed a group of men standing beside a railroad car, their faces clearly visible in the mountain sunlight. At the center of the group stood a tall man with distinctive facial hair and an expensive suit, almost certainly Marcus Whitmore himself. But it was the other faces that captured Boone's attention, men whose features bore unmistakable resemblances to prominent families he recognized from modern Montana society. Photographic evidence transformed the documents from historical curiosities into immediate relevance. These weren't just century-old crimes committed by long-dead men. They were the foundation events that had shaped the current power structure of the entire region. Families that still wielded enormous influence in politics, business, and land development owed their positions to wealth originally accumulated through murder and systematic corruption. As Boone carefully repacked the photographic evidence, he realized that Whitmore's plan had been even more sophisticated than he'd initially understood. The railroad president hadn't just been trying to expose past crimes. He'd been trying to prevent future ones by documenting the methods and relationships that enabled corruption to flourish. Each cache represented not just evidence, but a warning to future generations about the true cost of unchecked power and greed. The afternoon sun was slanting low through the mountain peaks by the time Boone made his way back to his cabin, carrying evidence that could potentially destroy some of Montana's most powerful families. The weight of that responsibility felt heavier than the physical burden of the photographic plates. Each image representing lives affected by decisions made in boardrooms and backrooms more than a century ago. That evening, as he prepared his simple meal and tried to process what he'd discovered, Boone found himself thinking about the nature of justice and the obligations that connected past to present. Whitmore had died trying to expose the truth about crimes that had shaped an entire territory's development. The question now was whether that truth still mattered, enough to justify the risks that pursuing it would inevitably entail. The decision to reach out to Margaret Chen came after 3 sleepless nights spent wrestling with the implications of what he'd discovered. Boone had always prided himself on self-reliance, on his ability to handle whatever challenges the mountains might present. But the evidence from Whitmore's caches represented problems beyond the scope of any individual's capability to address. He needed someone with research skills, someone who understood how to navigate the complex world of historical documentation and legal procedures that lay beyond his mountain domain. Margaret met him at the Millerville diner on a grey October morning that promised snow before evening. She arrived precisely on time, carrying a worn leather satchel and wearing the kind of practical clothes that suggested someone accustomed to serious work rather than casual conversation. Her handshake was firm, her eyes direct, and her questions immediate. "Whatever you found," she said over coffee that had been brewing too long, "it's significant enough to make you nervous. I can see it in the way you keep checking the door, the way you chose a table where you can watch the parking lot. So let's skip the small talk and get to the point. What kind of help do you need?" Boone appreciated her directness. He'd spent too many years in the mountains to have patience for social niceties when serious matters demanded attention. Without revealing specific details, he outlined what he'd discovered: historical documents that could shed new light on territorial-era corruption, evidence that might implicate prominent families in crimes that had shaped the region's development. "The thing is," he concluded, "I don't know how to handle evidence like this properly. Don't know who to trust with it or what the legal implications might be. Don't even know if crimes that old can still be prosecuted." Margaret listened without interruption, her expression growing more serious as he spoke. When he finished, she sat quietly for several minutes, stirring her coffee and apparently working through the implications of what he'd told her. "Prosecution would be impossible," she finally said. "Statutes of limitations, the age of the alleged crimes, the death of all potential defendants. No prosecutor would even consider it. But that doesn't mean the evidence lacks value. Historical documentation of systematic corruption could have enormous impact on current legal cases, property disputes, federal land management issues. Some of those territorial-era land grants are still being contested in court." She paused, studying his face carefully. "More importantly, if what you've found is as significant as you suggest, there are people who would pay almost anything to keep it hidden. Family reputations, political careers, business empires, they could all be vulnerable to the right kind of historical revelation. Are you prepared for that level of scrutiny and potential retaliation?" The question hung between them like morning mist, carrying implications that Boone had been trying not to consider. He'd spent 30 years in these mountains, specifically to avoid the complications that came with human society, the endless web of obligations and conflicts that civilized life seemed to generate. Now he found himself contemplating a course of action that would thrust him directly into the center of exactly the kind of controversy he'd spent decades avoiding. "I keep thinking about something Whitmore wrote," he said finally, "about how the dead deserve justice and the living deserve truth. Maybe crimes that old can't be prosecuted, but that doesn't mean they should be forgotten. Doesn't mean the people who benefited from them should continue benefiting without consequence." Margaret nodded slowly. "There are ways to handle this kind of evidence responsibly. academic institutions, historical societies, investigative journalists who specialize in this kind of research. The key is building a coalition of credible people who can examine and verify the documentation before making any public revelations. Over the following hour, they developed the outline of a plan that balanced Boone's desire for discretion with the need to ensure the evidence received proper attention. Margaret would make discreet contact with historians and journalists who had already been researching territorial-era corruption, feeling out their interest without revealing specific details. Meanwhile, Boone would continue examining the evidence he'd found, looking for additional context and corroborating documentation. "There's something else you should know," Margaret said as they prepared to leave. "I've been getting questions lately from people claiming to represent various historical societies and genealogical organizations. They're asking about territorial-era records, specifically railroad documents and land grant files. It could be coincidence, but the timing is interesting." The drive back to his cabin gave Boone time to process the implications of Margaret's warning. If people were already asking questions about territorial-era railroad records, his discovery of Whitmore's evidence might not be as random as it had initially seemed. Perhaps the past was finally catching up with the present, forcing a reckoning that had been delayed for more than a century. That afternoon, he returned to Dead Elk Lake to examine the widow's wake more thoroughly. In light of what he'd learned from the various caches, the boat itself might contain additional clues about Whitmore's final days and the elaborate plan he'd constructed for preserving evidence of the Northern Mountain Railroad's crimes, working more systematically than he had during his initial exploration. Boone discovered that the boat's construction included several hidden compartments that he'd missed during his earlier examination. These spaces were smaller than the main strongbox compartment, designed to hold specific items rather than general storage. In one, he found a collection of keys labeled with numbers that corresponded to bank deposit boxes in Denver and San Francisco. In another, he discovered detailed maps showing the locations of additional evidence caches throughout the Montana Territory. Most intriguingly, he found a sealed metal tube containing what appeared to be Whitmore's final letter, written in the days immediately before his disappearance. The document was addressed to whoever discovers this evidence, and its contents revealed the full scope of the railroad. President's plan for posthumous justice. "I write this knowing that I will likely not live to see another winter," the letter began. "Thompson and his associates have made their intentions clear, though they lack the courage to act directly against me while I remain in public view. I've therefore made arrangements to disappear in a manner that will suggest accidental death, while allowing me to survive long enough to complete the documentation of their crimes." The letter went on to describe an elaborate deception involving a staged train accident and a carefully planned flight to the mountain hideouts Whitmore had prepared over the previous months. He'd intended to spend the winter in the remote cabin, completing his evidence collection and preparing for a spring revelation that would destroy the Northern Mountain Railroad and bring its leaders to justice. "If you are reading this," the letter concluded, "then my plan has failed, and I have indeed perished before completing my mission. I pray that you will have the courage to finish what I could not, to ensure that the crimes documented in these caches receive the attention they deserve. The wealth hidden with this evidence should provide sufficient resources to pursue justice, regardless of the obstacles that Thompson's heirs may place in your path." As evening shadows began to gather around Dead Elk Lake, Boone sat in the boat that had protected Whitmore's secrets for 40 years, and contemplated the full weight of the responsibility that had fallen to him. The railroad president's plan had indeed failed, but not in the way he'd anticipated. Instead of dying in his mountain hideout, Whitmore had been caught and killed before he could complete his mission. Now, decades later, his carefully preserved evidence was finally seeing daylight, carried forward by a man who had never expected to become the executor of a dead stranger's quest for justice. The revelation came in the form of a visitor Boone hadn't expected. arriving on a crisp November morning when frost had turned the world silver and the lake reflected the sky like polished metal. He'd been examining the photographic plates in his kitchen when he heard the distant rumble of an engine struggling up the mountain road, unusual enough that he immediately set aside his work and stepped onto the porch to investigate. The vehicle that emerged from the trees was a black SUV with tinted windows, expensive and out of place in the remote wilderness surrounding Dead Elk Lake. It parked beside Boone's weathered pickup truck like a predator beside its prey, the contrast between the two vehicles highlighting just how far from civilization his cabin really was. The man who stepped out was equally out of place, tall, well-dressed, and carrying himself with the kind of confidence that came from money and power. "Mr. Tiller," the stranger said, approaching the porch with a smile that didn't reach his eyes. "My name is James Thompson. I believe you've recently made some discoveries that might be of mutual interest." The name hit Boone like a physical blow. Thompson, the same surname that had appeared throughout Whitmore's documents as the architect of corruption and murder. This man was younger, perhaps 45, but the resemblance to the face Boone had seen in the historical photographs was unmistakable. The strong jaw, the calculating eyes, the bearing that suggested someone accustomed to getting his way through intimidation or purchase. "I don't know what you're talking about," Boone said carefully, his hand resting casually on the porch rail where he'd placed a heavy wrench earlier that morning. Thompson's smile widened slightly, as though he appreciated the caution, but found it ultimately pointless. "Come now, Mr. Tiller. We both know you've been exploring that old boat down on the lake. We both know what you found inside. The question is whether we can reach an arrangement that benefits us both, or whether this situation needs to become more complicated than either of us would prefer." The casual menace in the man's voice confirmed Boone's worst suspicions. The Thompson family had somehow learned about his discoveries, which meant they'd been watching him for weeks without his knowledge. Worse, it suggested they possessed resources and connections that could make his life very difficult. If he chose not to cooperate with whatever arrangement they had in mind. My great-grandfather Silas left very detailed records about his business dealings, Thompson continued, settling into one of the porch chairs without invitation, including his arrangements with Marcus Whitmore and the unfortunate necessity of terminating that relationship when Whitmore became unreliable. Those records include detailed descriptions of the evidence Whitmore accumulated, along with the locations where he planned to hide it. Boone felt his blood turn cold. If the Thompson family had possessed detailed knowledge of Whitmore's caches for more than a century, why had they waited until now to retrieve them? The answer became clear as Thompson continued speaking. The problem, you see, was that Whitmore chose his hiding places too well. We knew the general area where he'd concealed his evidence, but the specific locations proved impossible to find without triggering exactly the kind of attention we preferred to avoid. So we waited, confident that time would eventually resolve the problem for us. Most hiding places fail over the course of decades. Weather, geological changes, human development. We expected Whitmore's evidence to simply disappear into history. Thompson paused to light a cigarette, the flame from his expensive lighter dancing in the morning air. What we didn't anticipate was someone like you, Mr. Tiller. Someone with the local knowledge, the persistence, and the sheer stubborn curiosity to find what had been lost for 40 years. Your discovery has created a problem that my family has been hoping to avoid for generations. What kind of problem? Boone asked, though he suspected he already knew the answer. The kind that could destroy everything my family has built over the past century and a half, Thompson replied matter-of-factly. Our wealth, our political influence, our social position, all of it traces back to decisions my great-grandfather made during the territorial period. Decisions that might be viewed unfavorably by modern standards of business ethics and legal conduct. The casual admission was more chilling than any direct threat could have been. Thompson was telling him that the family's power had indeed been built on the corruption and murder that Whitmore had documented, and that they were prepared to do whatever was necessary to protect that legacy. The implications were staggering. If one prominent family had maintained its influence through knowledge of century-old crimes, how many others might be in similar positions? "Here's what's going to happen," Thompson said, dropping his cigarette and crushing it under an expensive boot. "You're going to turn over all the evidence you found, documents, photographs, gold, bonds, everything. In exchange, my family will ensure that you're compensated generously for your time and trouble. Enough money to live comfortably for the rest of your days, anywhere you choose to go. And if I refuse—" Thompson's expression hardened slightly, revealing the ruthless calculation that lay beneath his civilized veneer. "Then you'll discover that some family traditions are stronger than others, Mr. Tiller. My great-grandfather dealt with problems like Marcus Whitmore in a very direct manner. While my methods are more sophisticated, they can be equally effective when circumstances require." The threat hung in the air between them like smoke from the discarded cigarette. Boone found himself studying the man's face, looking for signs of uncertainty or bluff, but finding only the cold confidence of someone who'd never been denied anything he truly wanted. This wasn't a desperate gamble, it was a business transaction, conducted with the same casual brutality that had characterized the Thompson family's dealings for more than a century. "I need time to think about this," Boone said finally. "Of course," Thompson replied, rising from the chair with fluid grace. "But not too much time. My patience, while considerable, does have limits. I'll return in 3 days for your answer. I trust that will be sufficient for you to make the right decision." He walked back to his SUV without looking back, the gravel crunching under his feet, the only sound in the mountain stillness. The engine started with a soft purr that spoke of expensive engineering, and the vehicle disappeared into the trees as quietly as it had arrived, leaving only tire tracks in the frost to prove the encounter hadn't been a nightmare. Boone stood on his porch for a long time after the sound of the engine had faded, his mind racing through the implications of what he'd just learned. The Thompson family's knowledge of Whitmore's evidence meant they'd been monitoring the situation for generations, waiting for exactly this kind of discovery. Their patience and resources suggested planning that spanned decades, the kind of long-term thinking that only came with enormous wealth and political influence. More troubling was the realization that his own discovery might not have been as accidental as he'd believed. Had the family somehow arranged for him to find the evidence, perhaps seeing him as a more controllable problem than professional treasure hunters or academic researchers? The thought that he might have been manipulated from the beginning added another layer of complexity to an already impossible situation. He walked back into his cabin and looked at the documents spread across his kitchen table. Boone understood that his 3 days of thinking time would determine not just his own fate, but the final disposition of Marcus Whitmore's 40-year quest for justice. The railroad president had died, believing that truth would eventually triumph over corruption. That evidence, carefully preserved, would someday bring accountability to those who had escaped it in life. Now, more than a century later, that belief was about to be tested by a confrontation between a mountain man who valued simple honesty and a family that had built an empire on sophisticated lies. The outcome would determine whether some secrets were indeed too dangerous to reveal, or whether justice could still be served regardless of how much time had passed since the original crimes were committed. The 3 days that followed Thompson's visit passed like a slow-burning fuse, each hour bringing Boone closer to a decision that would define not just his own future, but the legacy of a man who had died more than a century earlier. Sleep came in fragments, interrupted by thoughts that circled like wolves around a campfire, never quite allowing him the peace necessary for rest. He found himself walking the familiar trails around his property at all hours, seeking in the eternal rhythms of the mountains some guidance for problems that seemed to have no clear solutions. On the second day, Margaret Chen arrived unannounced, her face tight with concern, and her usual calm demeanor replaced by obvious agitation. She'd driven up from Millerville with news that transformed the situation from a personal dilemma into something far more complex and dangerous. "They've been asking about you," she said without preamble, settling into a chair at his kitchen table where Whitmore's documents still lay spread like accusations against the past. People claiming to represent various historical societies, genealogical organizations, even a university research program. But when I started checking their credentials, half of them don't exist, and the other half have no record of current research projects in Montana. Boone poured coffee for them both, his hands steady despite the growing weight of circumstances beyond his control. "How many people are we talking about?" "At least 6 different inquiries in the past week, all asking about territorial-era railroad records, all specifically interested in documents related to the Northern Mountain Railroad." "That's not coincidence, Boone. Someone with serious resources is trying to track down exactly what you've found," Margaret's revelation confirmed. What he'd suspected since Thompson's visit, the situation had implications that extended far beyond a simple confrontation between himself and one wealthy family. If multiple organizations were searching for the same evidence, it suggested either a coordinated effort by the Thompson family or the involvement of additional parties with their own interests in keeping the past buried. "There's something else," Margaret continued, her voice dropping to barely above a whisper. "I did some research on James Thompson, the man you described. He's not just wealthy, Boone. He's connected to political networks that reach all the way to Washington, D.C. His family's foundation provides funding for historical preservation projects, genealogical research, even some academic programs. If he wanted to suppress or discredit historical evidence, he'd have the resources and connections to make it happen." The implications were staggering. A family with the power to influence academic research and historical documentation could effectively control how the past was interpreted and presented to future generations. Whitmore's evidence might represent more than just proof of century-old crimes. It could be the key to understanding how those crimes had been systematically concealed and their consequences perpetuated across the decades. That afternoon, working together in the careful silence that comes with shared purpose, Boone and Margaret began the meticulous process of documenting and copying every piece of evidence from Whitmore's caches. Using Margaret's digital camera and portable scanner, they created comprehensive records of each document, each photograph, each piece of correspondence that revealed the scope of the Northern Mountain Railroad's corruption. The work was painstaking, but necessary. If Thompson's family possessed the resources to make original evidence disappear, then copies distributed to multiple secure locations might provide the only insurance against historical suppression. Margaret had contacts at 3 different universities, along with relationships with investigative journalists who specialized in historical exposés. A comprehensive distribution strategy could ensure that the evidence survived, even if the originals were somehow compromised. As they worked, patterns emerged that neither of them had noticed during individual examination of the documents. Cross-references between different caches revealed that Whitmore's investigation had uncovered not just isolated instances of corruption, but a systematic network that extended far beyond the Northern Mountain Railroad. Territorial officials, federal land commissioners, even some military commanders had been compromised by bribes and political pressure that traced back to the railroad's financial interests. "This isn't just about one family," Margaret observed, studying a photograph that showed a meeting between railroad officials and men in military uniforms. "This is about how the entire territorial system was corrupted by railroad money. If this evidence became public, it could force re-examination of land grants, treaty violations, even some federal policies that are still in effect today." The scope of potential implications began to explain why the Thompson family had been so patient in their approach to the problem. They weren't just protecting their own reputation, they were safeguarding a network of relationships and obligations that had shaped the development of the entire American West. The evidence in Whitmore's caches could unravel more than a century of carefully constructed historical narratives. By evening, they had completed their documentation and begun the process of creating secure copies for distribution. Margaret would carry one complete set back to Millerville, where she could upload digital copies to secure cloud storage and begin making contact with her academic and journalistic sources. Additional physical copies would be stored in safe deposit boxes in 3 different cities, ensuring that no single point of failure could compromise the entire archive. "What will you tell Thompson when he returns?" Margaret asked as they packed the last of the copied materials. Boone had been wrestling with that question for 2 days, weighing options that all seemed to carry unacceptable risks. Compliance with Thompson's demands would ensure his personal safety, but would betray Whitmore's sacrifice and guarantee that the railroad president's quest for justice ended in failure. Defiance would honor Whitmore's memory, but could result in consequences that Boone was not entirely prepared to face. "I keep thinking about something Whitmore wrote in his journal," he said finally, "about how a man can only compromise his principles so far before he ceases to be a man at all. I've spent 30 years in these mountains, trying to live by simple principles: honesty, self-reliance, respect for what came before. Maybe it's time to find out what those principles are worth when they're truly tested." Margaret nodded slowly, understanding the weight of what he was considering. "You know, this could change everything about your life up here. Once this evidence becomes public, you'll never have the anonymity and privacy you've valued for so long." "Maybe," Boone replied, "but some things are more important than personal comfort. Whitmore died trying to expose the truth about crimes that shaped this whole territory. If I walk away from that now, if I let Thompson buy my silence with threats and bribes, then I become part of the same corruption that killed a good man more than a century ago." That night, after Margaret had driven back down the mountain with her precious cargo of copied evidence, Boone sat on his porch and contemplated the lake where the widow's wake still rested against the shore. The boat that had protected Whitmore's secrets for 40 years looked different now, less like an abandoned relic and more like a monument to principles that transcended the passage of time. The morning of the 3rd day dawned clear and cold, with the kind of crystalline air that made every detail stand out sharp and clean. Boone spent the early hours making preparations that would have seemed paranoid just a week earlier, but now felt like reasonable precautions. He secured the original documents in a location known only to himself and Margaret, arranged for emergency communication protocols, and made practical preparations for the possibility that his quiet mountain existence was about to end permanently. When Thompson's black SUV appeared on the road just after noon, Boone was waiting on his porch with coffee that had grown cold and a decision that had taken 3 days to crystallize into absolute certainty. The wealthy man emerged from his vehicle with the same confident bearing he'd displayed during his first visit. But Boone thought he detected subtle signs of tension around the eyes, a tightness in the jaw that suggested the 3-day delay had not been entirely welcome. "Mr. Tiller," Thompson said, climbing the porch steps with measured deliberation, "I trust you've had sufficient time to consider my proposal." "I have," Boone replied, setting down his coffee cup and meeting the other man's gaze directly. "And I've decided that some things aren't for sale." Thompson's expression didn't change, but something shifted in his posture, a subtle redistribution of weight that spoke of preparation for violence. "I was hoping you'd be more reasonable, Mr. Tiller. Disappointing, but not entirely unexpected. Men who live in isolation sometimes develop unrealistic notions about their ability to stand against larger forces." "Maybe," Boone said. "But I guess we're about to find out just how realistic my notions are." The confrontation that would determine the fate of Marcus Whitmore's evidence was about to begin, played out between 2 men whose lives had been shaped by entirely different understandings of power, responsibility, and the price of principle in a world where wealth could purchase almost anything except genuine integrity. Thompson's composure cracked like ice under pressure, revealing the cold calculation that had always lurked beneath his civilized veneer. He reached inside his jacket with practiced smoothness, producing a pistol that gleamed dully in the mountain sunlight, expensive, functional, and absolutely deadly in its implications. "You've made this much more difficult than it needed to be," he said, his voice carrying the same conversational tone he might use to discuss the weather. "My great-grandfather understood that some problems require direct solutions. I'd hoped modern methods would prove more effective, but it seems the old ways have their place after all." Boone felt the familiar calm that had served him through decades of hunting dangerous game in unforgiving terrain. Fear was there, certainly, but it was controlled fear, channeled into heightened awareness rather than paralysis. His eyes tracked Thompson's movements while his mind calculated distances, angles, and possibilities with the methodical precision of a man who had spent his life making split-second decisions in life-or-death situations. "The evidence you found belongs to my family," Thompson continued, the gun steady in his hand. "It represents threats to legitimate business interests that have provided employment and prosperity to thousands of people over the past century. Your romantic notions about historical justice pale beside the practical reality of modern economic stability." "Funny thing about evidence," Boone said quietly, his hands remaining visible and still. "It has a way of multiplying when people try to suppress it." Whitmore understood that principle, which is why he scattered his documentation across multiple locations. Something flickered in Thompson's eyes. Uncertainty, perhaps, or the first recognition that the situation might be more complex than he'd anticipated. "You're bluffing. Our research into Whitmore's activities was thorough. We know about the caches, we know about the boat, and we know about your recent discoveries. What we don't know is where you've hidden the materials you removed from those locations." "Then you don't know as much as you think you do," Boone replied. The conversation was buying him time to assess his options, but those options were limited by the weapon in Thompson's hand and the man's obvious willingness to use it. The porch provided little cover, and the distance between them was too great for any physical intervention that wouldn't end with bullets flying. Thompson stepped closer, close enough that Boone could see the family resemblance to the historical photographs even more clearly. The same arrogant bearing, the same assumption that wealth and position granted the right to dispose of inconvenient people like pieces on a chessboard. Some character traits, it seemed, passed down through generations as reliably as eye color or height. "Here's what's going to happen," Thompson said, the gun now pointed directly at Boone's chest. "You're going to tell me where you've hidden Whitmore's evidence, all of it. Then you're going to help me retrieve and destroy every document, every photograph, every scrap of paper that could threaten my family's interests. In exchange, your death will look like an accident, a tragic fall while hiking these dangerous mountains you love so much. And if I refuse?" Thompson's smile held no warmth whatsoever. "Then your death will be much less pleasant, and I'll still get what I want." Margaret Chen has been asking questions about territorial-era railroad records. She's become quite the local expert on historical research. I'm sure she'll be happy to share her knowledge once she understands the consequences of academic curiosity, the threat against. Margaret transformed Boone's controlled fear into something much more dangerous. The woman had become involved in this situation because of his request for help, and the thought of her suffering consequences for his decisions was intolerable. But it also confirmed that Thompson's resources and ruthlessness extended far beyond what he'd initially realized. "You made one mistake," Boone said, his voice carrying a new edge that made Thompson's eyes narrow slightly. "You assumed I was working alone." The sound of vehicles approaching up the mountain road came like distant thunder, growing louder with each passing second. Thompson's head turned slightly toward the sound, his confidence wavering as he realized that the isolated confrontation he'd planned might not unfold according to his carefully orchestrated script. "Federal agents," Boone continued, watching Thompson's face carefully. Turns out that evidence of systematic corruption involving federal land grants draws attention from people with more authority than historical societies or academic researchers. Amazing how quickly bureaucrats move when someone threatens to expose crimes that could invalidate millions of acres of federal land. Transfers. Thompson's gun wavered as the implications of Boone's words sank in. The approaching vehicles were now clearly visible through the trees. 3 black SUVs with government plates, moving with the purposeful speed of an official operation. Whatever contingency plans the Thompson family had developed over the decades, they apparently hadn't included federal intervention on this scale. "You're lying," Thompson said, but uncertainty had crept into his voice. "No one else knows about this evidence." "Margaret Chen has friends in interesting places," Boone replied. "Turns out some of those academic contacts include people who work for agencies that take a very dim view of historical fraud involving federal resources. They've been building their own case for months, just waiting for someone to provide the missing pieces." The lead vehicle crested the final rise and came into full view, its occupants clearly visible through the windshield. Men in dark suits, moving with the coordinated precision of a law enforcement operation. Thompson's carefully planned confrontation had become something entirely different, a federal investigation that would expose not just his family's historical crimes, but their ongoing efforts to suppress evidence and intimidate witnesses. The federal agents moved with practiced efficiency as they surrounded the cabin, their weapons drawn, but not yet aimed, their voices carrying the calm authority of professionals executing a well-rehearsed operation. The lead agent, a woman in her 40s with steel-gray hair and eyes that missed nothing, stepped onto the porch with her badge clearly visible. "James Thompson," she said, her voice cutting through the mountain air like a blade. "Special Agent Sarah Martinez, Federal Bureau of Investigation. You're under arrest for conspiracy, witness intimidation, and violations of federal racketeering statutes." Thompson's gun hand trembled slightly. The weapon still pointed in Boone's general direction, but no longer held with the steady confidence it had possessed moments earlier. His carefully controlled expression dissolved into something approaching panic as he realized that decades of family planning had failed to anticipate this particular scenario. "This is private property," he said, his voice rising with desperation. "You have no authority here, no jurisdiction over a simple business dispute between private parties." Agent Martinez smiled with the kind of professional courtesy that carried more menace than any direct threat. "Actually, Mr. Thompson, we have extensive jurisdiction when the dispute involves federal crimes that span multiple states and territories. Your family's activities have been under investigation for 18 months, ever since certain historical documents surfaced during a routine audit of federal land grants in Wyoming." The revelation hit Thompson like a physical blow. His gun lowered slightly as the implications became clear. The federal investigation hadn't begun with Boone's discoveries, but had been underway for months, building a case that Whitmore's evidence would now complete rather than initiate. The Thompson family's century-long effort to suppress the past had finally collided with modern law enforcement capabilities. The evidence Mr. Tiller discovered provides crucial corroboration for allegations we've been investigating across multiple federal agencies, Martinez continued. Your decision to threaten him with violence has simply added contemporary charges to a historical case that was already quite substantial, Boone. Watch the confrontation unfold with a mixture of relief and fascination. The careful plans he and Margaret had made for protecting and distributing Whitmore's evidence had apparently intersected with a much larger investigation that neither of them had suspected. The mountain solitude that had seemed so isolating just days earlier was now the center of a federal operation that would reshape how the entire territorial period was understood and remembered. Thompson's composure finally shattered completely. The gun swung wildly between Boone and the federal agents, his finger tight on the trigger as desperation overrode the calculated planning that had brought him to this moment. For several heartbeats, the porch balanced on the knife edge between surrender and violence. With the fate of more than a century's worth of carefully guarded secrets hanging in the mountain air. "Put the weapon down, Mr. Thompson," Martinez said quietly. "There's nowhere to run, no way to fight your way out of this situation. Your best option now is cooperation with our investigation." "My family built this territory," Thompson said, his voice breaking with the strain of a lifetime's worth of arrogance confronting its first genuine failure. "Everything you see around here, the towns, the railroads, the prosperity, it all traces back to decisions my great-grandfather made. Decisions that might seem harsh by modern standards, but were necessary for progress and development. Progress built on murder and systematic corruption," Boone said quietly. "Progress that cost good people their lives and their land. Marcus Whitmore died trying to expose those crimes, and your family has spent more than a century making sure his sacrifice was meaningless." The words seemed to strike Thompson harder than any physical blow. His gun hand shook violently as the full weight of historical judgment settled on his shoulders. For the first time in his life, he was facing consequences that couldn't be purchased, influenced or intimidated away. The end came suddenly, without the dramatic confrontation that such moments often promised. Thompson's nerve broke entirely, the gun falling from nerveless fingers to clatter on the porch boards as he collapsed into one of the chairs where he delivered his ultimatum just days earlier. The federal agents moved immediately, securing the weapon and placing him under arrest with professional efficiency that spoke of countless similar operations. As they led Thompson away in handcuffs, Agent Martinez turned to Boone with an expression that mixed respect and curiosity. "Mr. Tiller, we're going to need extensive testimony from you about what you discovered and how you discovered it. This case is going to require careful documentation of every piece of evidence and its chain of custody." Boone nodded, understanding that his quiet mountain existence was indeed ending, replaced by a role he'd never sought, but now felt obligated to fulfill. "Whatever you need," he said. "Whitmore spent 40 years waiting for justice. I reckon I can spare whatever time it takes to see that he finally gets it." The lake below reflected the afternoon sky like polished silver, and somewhere on its shore, the widow's wake waited with the patience that only the mountains could teach. The boat that had protected Marcus Whitmore's quest for justice through 4 decades of silence had finally fulfilled its purpose, transforming from a rotting relic into the key that would unlock more than a century's worth of carefully guarded secrets. 6 months after the arrest of James Thompson, Boone stood once again on the shore of Dead Elk Lake, watching the morning mist rise from water that reflected the changing sky like a mirror of time itself. The lake looked the same as it had for decades, eternal and unchanging, but everything else about his world had been transformed by the events that began with a simple decision to salvage lumber from an abandoned boat. The widow's wake no longer rested against the rocky shore. The federal investigation had required her removal to a secure facility where experts could examine every inch of her construction for additional evidence. She would eventually find her way to a museum, Agent Martinez had promised, where visitors could learn about Marcus Whitmore's courage and the elaborate plan he'd devised to preserve truth for future generations. The boat that had waited 40 years for someone to discover her secrets would now serve as a monument to the persistence of justice. Even when that justice was delayed by decades, the federal case against the Thompson family had expanded far beyond what anyone had initially anticipated. Whitmore's evidence, combined with documents uncovered by the ongoing federal investigation, had revealed a network of corruption that extended across multiple states and involved dozens of prominent families whose wealth could be traced back to territorial-era crimes. Land grants were being re-examined, federal treaties were being reassessed, and several major corporations were facing civil lawsuits that could cost them millions in restitution to Native American tribes and environmental groups. James Thompson himself had accepted a plea agreement that would keep him in federal prison for the next 15 years, but more importantly, had provided testimony that implicated dozens of other individuals in ongoing efforts to suppress historical evidence and intimidate researchers. The family's carefully constructed network of influence had collapsed like a house of cards once federal investigators began pulling at the threads that Whitmore's evidence had provided. Margaret Chen had become something of a celebrity in academic circles. Her role in preserving and distributing the historical evidence earning her recognition from universities and historical societies across the country. She'd accepted a position with the National Archives, where she would oversee a new program designed to investigate and document instances of historical suppression and evidence destruction. Her first major project would be a comprehensive study of territorial-era corruption and its impact on modern land ownership patterns throughout the American West. For Boone, the changes had been more profound and more personal. The quiet anonymity he'd valued for 3 decades was gone forever, replaced by a role as the primary witness in one of the most significant historical exposés of the century. He'd testified before congressional committees, spoken at academic conferences, and been interviewed by journalists from around the world who wanted to understand how a simple mountain man had uncovered evidence that had eluded professional historians for generations. The financial implications of his discovery had proven as complex as the legal ones. The gold coins and bearer bonds from Whitmore's strongboxes were indeed valuable, worth more than $5 million at current market prices. But claiming that wealth had required navigating a maze of legal procedures, tax implications, and ethical considerations that would have been impossible without the legal assistance provided by the federal government as part of their investigation. In the end, Boone had chosen to establish a foundation dedicated to historical research and justice advocacy, using Whitmore's treasure to fund the very kind of investigation that the railroad president had dreamed of conducting more than a century earlier. The foundation would support researchers working to uncover suppressed historical evidence, provide legal assistance to communities seeking restitution for historical injustices, and ensure that future generations would have access to the complete truth about how the American West had been developed and by whom. The irony wasn't lost on him that wealth accumulated through corruption, and murder was now being used to expose and address exactly those kinds of crimes. Whitmore would have appreciated the symmetry. Boone thought, justice funded by the very crimes it sought to redress, truth preserved by the treasure that had been hidden to protect it. His cabin remained largely unchanged, though he'd finally built the workshop addition he'd been planning, using lumber salvaged from the widow's wake before her removal to federal custody. Working with his hands in the quiet space filled with the scent of century-old oak, he often thought about the man who had planned so carefully for a justice that he would never live to see. Every piece of furniture he crafted from that reclaimed wood was a small monument to persistence, to the belief that truth would eventually triumph over even the most sophisticated efforts to suppress it. The lake reflected the stars that night as Boone sat on his porch, contemplating the strange turns that life could take when a man simply tried to do what seemed right in each moment as it presented itself. He'd never sought to become the executor of a dead stranger's quest for justice, never intended to challenge powerful families or expose century-old crimes. But sometimes, he'd learned, the most important choices were the ones that chose you rather than the ones you made deliberately. Somewhere in the darkness beyond the lake, the mountains held other secrets, other stories waiting for someone with the patience and courage to uncover them. The past never truly disappeared. It simply waited, like morning mist on still water, for the right conditions to reveal itself again. And in that revelation lay the possibility of justice, delayed perhaps but never finally denied, carried forward by ordinary people who understood that some things were more important than personal comfort or safety. The stars wheeled overhead in their ancient patterns, and somewhere among them, Boone imagined, Marcus Whitmore finally rested in peace, his long quest for justice complete at last.